All right, welcome everybody. This is Shabbir Safdar. I am your host, and I'm just going to put some slides up and wait for a few more people to join, and then we will get started. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your time with us today. We appreciate it. I think I'm going to have that right. I will ask my panelists, does the deck look like it looks good to you? Is it up on screen? Okay, that's great.
Yes.
And we have, let's see, we have 9 attendees. Okay, so I'm going to read bios while we're waiting for the last few people to show up. I like being timely. My guests today are two people that I have worked with significantly for the past couple of years. I really like them, and so it's a pleasure to actually be also on a panel with them. Garth Reynolds is a pharmacist licensed in both Illinois and Missouri, which is my home state. And he has worked in both independent, regional, and national pharmacy environments. He's also a lecturer on various School of Pharmacy topics like pharmacy technology, regulation, drug diversion, and prescription fraud. He serves as the executive director of the Illinois Pharmacists Association, and he's going to give us that perspective. Christina Adams, who also has an adorable daughter, which I know from following her on Facebook, is the Chief Pharmacy Officer of the Canadian Society of Hospital Pharmacists. She started her career at CSHP as an intern in 2005, and even today is fluent and practices pharmacy in both English and French. I barely have a command of one language. I cannot imagine doing my job in two. She has worked in multiple practice settings, including hospital in-person, telepharmacist, and pharmacy oversight at hospitals throughout Ontario. And it's really unique for me to be able to have pharmacists from both sides of the border to talk about proposals that affect the supply chain and affect pharmacy and patients. And so for me, this is really exciting. Let's go ahead and we'll start. I'm going to do a little bit about this policy, this drug importation policy that we've seen that doesn't ever seem to go away, but never seems to sort of work. And then Christina's going to talk about what this policy means in Canada, which is, I think, a perspective a lot of people don't get to hear very often. Canadians don't often weigh in on state policy or U.S. federal policy decisions. And then Garth is going to give us some history and then talk about some of the factors that happen here with PBMs that also keep prices artificially high. So let's really quick, start with the first one. If you like what you hear today, you want to know more about PSM, you can find us on the web, on Facebook, on Twitter, and we do a new video on a counterfeit story in America every week. It's posted to all of those channels and on YouTube. Believe it or not, there's about a dozen counterfeit stories in America every week, counterfeit drug stories, and we have to difficultly pick from one. And if you don't know PSM, some of you on this call I've actually presented to before. We are a coalition of everyone who touches medicine from the factory floor to the patient. So manufacturers, both branded and generic, wholesalers, distributors, pharmacists, and of course, patients as well. So the idea of importation comes from way back in the Bush administration when in the Medicare Modernization Act, they delivered, as part of that legislation, a legal framework for importing medicine from Canada. And that proposal pretty much stopped right there. No FDA commissioner or HHS secretary for the next 17 or so years thought that was a good idea and went on the record to say so until this last administration, which pushed it forward. And since then, states have also undertaken this idea. 14 states roughly have thought about that legislation to import bulk medicine from Canada in the last year or so. 5 states started to try and do it, but their implementation is stalled. 2 states are burning money right now to do it. They also have not imported anything, nor do they have permission from HHS, the US government, nor do they have permission or a seller in Canada. So they're hitting the point that we predicted they would hit, which is that implementing this is extremely difficult. Vermont's program stalled because they realized that the amount of money they could save was not enough to justify the cost, and the cost, even estimating the cost, was going to be significant. New Hampshire passed a law, possibly for show. There's been no effort to actually submit a permission slip to the US government, to HHS, and they blew through their legislative deadline. New Mexico passed a law and then produced their proposal, which they submitted to HHS, but Canada shut the door on it just 2 weeks before that submission, and said they were not going to really allow that kind of bulk export from Canada. One of the problems, and the real problem with these proposals, is that they take the place and suck up oxygen from real proposals that would actually bring down the price of medicine. One of the problems we're finding is that there's no Medicaid programs that really would save money by bulk importing from Canada. Many Medicaid programs in some cases get money cheaper than the provinces negotiate prices for. So Maine, for example, looked at their top 50 drugs, added up what they pay versus what would be paid if they imported them from Canada, and found out they lose about $900,000 because they already get better pricing. And so you've seen every state eject, except for Florida, eject the idea of saving money on Medicaid for the state through these programs. Colorado as well pulled out all of their Medicaid coverage, and that's a fifth of the population of the state. So once you take out a 20%, 25% of the population from your savings program, these things don't save as much money anymore. At the same time, Colorado has burned around $500,000 to $1 million trying to implement it, which seems crazy since the Canadian government has already said no, they don't want anything to do with that. And then lastly, I can't talk in too much detail about this, but these rules that the federal government put in place under the Trump administration last year, the regulations that would allow this had a lot of flaws in them and some serious safety concerns. And so we've actually gone into court to overturn those regulations. And I, of course, cannot provide any kind of prediction about how that would work. But we think that we have a pretty strong case for overturning them in federal court. So that's where these proposals are now. I think it's also worth asking, what exactly, since it takes two to tango, and the Canadians have to sell us what we want to buy from them, what do they think about this? So I'd like Christina actually to take a moment and chime in. And let me just switch to the next slide for you.
Thanks, Shabbir. So yeah, what's going on in Canada, and why, what do we, the royal we, have to think about it? So in 2018, and generally speaking, the Canadian population is about 1/10 of the American population. And so we are considerably smaller, whether not in geography, but at least in population. And so certainly that is a factor when you look at importation from Canada. You can see here a recent CBC News article regarding a particular medication called tamoxifen used in breast cancer survivors that we were critically short of not that long ago. And really, this is only part of the story. We've, over the last 10 years or so, have seen a significant amount of shortages that have a real impact on patient care. And so, it's not, our drug supply is certainly tenuous at times in terms of specific medications. And so we're not flush with medications, we're a small population, and this is sort of our country at the moment. So on the next slide, you'll see that a little bit about medication supply in Canada. So we do not manufacture most of the medication that is sold here in the country. We manufacture only about 1/3 of the medications we use here. And of those medications, 90% of the active ingredients are sourced from elsewhere, overseas, different raw materials available from different countries. And so you can see here, we have we significantly depend on the global drug supply chain in order to ensure that we have medications for our patients. Medication is shipped to Canada on an annual allocation, and so global drug manufacturers will set limits onto how much medication they'll send to Canada, and it's based on our Canadian population, what they think we'll need for our patients in a given year. And this medication is restricted on import, and so our wholesalers cannot export any medication that they import into the country. It's meant for Canadian destinations only, Canadian patients only. And so there's really not an ability for our wholesalers to export medications without contravening any contracts they may have with the manufacturers. Pretty much every company supplying medications to Canada are not headquartered in Canada. And so, we have a relatively low ability to, pressure them in any way to sell us more medication because they are not headquartered with us. And so we represent approximately 2% of the global market, and the United States represents 44% of the global market for medications. And so you can see there's a significant disparity in the quantity of medications that Canada represents on the global scale. Shortages are a real and ongoing concern. This information here is as recent as Friday. And you can see we have currently approximately 1,500 drug shortages reported in Canada, and that's almost 10% of our drug supply at the moment. And so we have a significant issue to this day. We don't have, there are many medications that we have that are in shortage. Some some impact Canadians more significantly than others, but all of them are a concern because they represent a significant amount of time that pharmacists, wholesalers, distributors, need to, and even the federal government in terms of Health Canada, the amount of time that we spend trying to mitigate the risks from these shortages is significant. And so we have these ongoing shortages right now. As you can see here, approximately a quarter of the drugs may be in short supply. This is a recent study from last fall. And it varies because although I mentioned a number about 10%, that number can fluctuate. And there are many medications that we have here in Canada that would not take much of a disruption in their supply to be in shortage. And so we have ongoing drug shortages in Canada that are significant. So how vulnerable is our supply chain? So a study in 2018 noted that if only 20% of American prescriptions were filled in Canada, so just 1/5 of prescriptions written in the United States were filled in Canada, our entire drug supply would last 182 days. And so just over 6 months would eliminate the entire Canadian drug supply chain, all of the medications here in Canada. And so, as you can imagine, that is a significant risk, and that's only based on 1/5 of prescriptions filled in Canada. So this is something that we cannot have happen in terms of in Canada because of the fact that we're going to not have any medications for our own patients in a very short period of time. And finally, the Canadian government has said no, they're not interested in supplying medications to meet the American demand. And they have noted that importing medicines from Canada would not significantly lower the prices of medications in the States. We're too small of a market, and we cannot increase our domestic pharmaceutical drug supply to meet an additional demand from the United States. And so last fall, the Canadian Health Canada and the federal government did issue a importation ban on American medications, ensuring that any medications that were being considered for export to the United States would not happen because of the potential for drug shortages. And so this was legislation from the federal government to prevent any importation or exportation from Canada into the United States that would have an impact on the Canadian drug supply and medications in short supply.
I gotta unmute fast. Thank you, Christina. Next, we want to hear from Garth to talk a little bit about whether there's any history with this program and what should we be focusing on instead. So let me just start here.
Okay. Thank you, Shabbir. And of course, we have tried this in Illinois and to a unsuccessful conclusion. And back during the Governor Rod Blagojevich administration, and specifically during the years of about starting in early as 2003 and then ending almost all the way up into 2009 in various minimal parts of it, we had the iSaveRx program. And this was an online-based program with trying to utilize not only importation from Canada, but also United Kingdom and Australia, New Zealand. And it was a coalition of states along with Wisconsin, Kansas, Missouri, and Vermont. And there were multitude of issues with this type of an approach when it was developed. Our Auditor General in Illinois, as part of an investigation of this program, found many federal violations with using unapproved federal funds to try to fund this type of a program. That many of the dispensing entities were in violation of the Illinois Pharmacy Practice Act, that numerous amounts of the facilities weren't properly inspected. And those individuals that did go out to inspect were actually not those that were trained or state of Illinois staff who were supposed to be properly utilized to inspect pharmacy facilities. But we also had high expenses, for a lot of this international travel. But in the uptake of the program was very small, and it was eventually canceled, and none of the states renewed it when Illinois came out of it. In addition to that, we also had issues with flu vaccine as well. Governor Blagojevich, because of a flu vaccine shortage, tried to import a lot of flu vaccine in from Europe and try to get approval from the FDA, but had committed Illinois dollars to that before the FDA approval would come down, and the approval never did come down for that. And these issues became such a big problem, not only with the flu vaccine, but the iSaveRx. It ended up becoming part of 2 articles of the 13 articles of impeachment against the eventual removal of Rod Blagojevich. As we go on to the next slide. So some other concerns for us from a United States pharmacy regulation side is that there currently is not a track and trace system in place in Canada as compared to the structure that the FDA and the United States Congress has set up through the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, and which puts additional regulations on U.S. pharmacies from the manufacturing line all the way down to the point of dispensing. And so having any type of outside system really erodes our established track and trace system that we've now fully implemented into the United States pharmaceutical regulatory system. Go on the next slide. But we really need to be looking at where the true high costs are. And that's where we really need to be digging into and pulling back the curtain on a lot of these issues around pharmacy benefit managers and how much they significantly add cost to the delivery of care in Illinois and around the nation as well. If you look at West Virginia Medicaid, as part of the Affordable Care Act, a lot of states expanded their Medicaid, and part of that expansion pushed a lot of states into privatizing or trying to carve out portions of their Medicaid population under a managed Medicaid system utilizing pharmacy benefit managers. Well, some states didn't think that they were getting as much of a benefit, cost savings benefit, and one of those states was West Virginia. And when they pulled all their pharmacy patients back under their traditional fee-for-service Medicaid, they found that they saved $54 million in just the first year of savings with that program. If you go to the next slide. And we commissioned through the Illinois Pharmacists Association a study with 3-Axis advisors, and we found a similar status with the Illinois program as well, because about 80% of our patients are in a managed Medicaid program, and we found despite the pharmacy reimbursement pressures, and the PBMs try to pay for these costs, but actually more of pad their pockets on the back of pharmacies, but they aren't passing along any additional cost savings to the state and ultimately the taxpayers. So pharmacies are increasingly losing money on the prescriptions that we're filling through utilizing these pharmacy benefit managers, who until very recently were not regulated in any fashion in Illinois, but they're also costing the state more and more money. So in 2019, with the help of a bipartisan support, we were able to pass House Bill 465, or Public Act, which is now Public Act 101 452, which helped establish a regulatory structure for pharmacy benefit managers. And we're continuing to work on that structure to help find more ways of increasing patient access to pharmacies in the state with Senate Bill 2008, and helping make sure that we have a sustainable pharmacy practice for all Illinoisans.
Thank you, Garth. So if you have questions, you can throw them into the question box, and I'm going to ask a couple that I have, since I have two of the smartest pharmacy people I know here. This is one I think that I hear a lot, Christina, which is, why can't Canada just order more medication? And normally I would think that if you were going to have more X that you were going to sell, then you could get a better price by ordering a larger quantity, and then you'd make money. So why can't you do that?
That's a great question. So, really, we mentioned before, Canada is a small player. We're 2% of the global market. And these production lines that manufacture medications for a global use, they're set, months, years in advance. And really, we can't just ask to buy more, because, in particularly, if the manufacturer thinks we're looking to buy more so that we Canadian distributors could sell more medications to the United States, sort of bypassing the existing sort of contracts that the manufacturers have with American states, then they're just going to cut off. There's the possibility that they'll just cut off selling to us, because we're so small, 2% of the global market, that they'll just be like, it's not worth our time. We're not going to sell to you, so that you can profit off of us losing profit, as it were, by selling directly to the United States. And so they're not just, from an economic point of view, I don't imagine that they'll see any benefit from just having us order more.
Garth, you've got a lot of experience explaining how PBMs work, given what you've been through over the last 2 years. Can you explain how a patient's price for medication might rise based upon the activities of a PBM?
Oh, exactly. I think one of the greatest examples, classes, medications to look at this is in insulin. And we will see very often where we have patients who are on a therapeutic regimen where they're completely in a positive health outcome situation. And all of a sudden their plan design changes, and one of their preferred medications is suddenly switched with no explanation. And a lot of times it puts them into a prior authorization situation, which puts up increased barriers for them to access a medication they were already on and that was approved as part of a clinical decision between their physician and the pharmacist and the patient. Or they may sometimes even have to pay a higher pocket because it may put it up to a more restricted tier. So they're putting more out of pocket. So and the patients aren't benefiting out of this because there wasn't a change in any type of clinical based data. This was all because of a monetary decision on the PBM side, because they weren't getting enough rebates from the pharmaceutical manufacturer. And so the pharmaceutical manufacturers are really put into this bullying pay-to-play system where to make sure that their products are available to patients, they have to pay off the PBMs to be able to get proper positioning on these formularies. It is a rather disgusting system that we've actually have allowed to occur. And I'm really glad to see the states finally standing up and starting to put additional regulations and restrictions on this type of activity, and really pulling back that curtain to take a look at where are these rebate dollars coming from? Are they going to employers, which is what is often stated by the PBMs, that they're saying, oh, well, we're pushing these savings along. Well, great, then prove it. And the employers and the plan sponsors aren't seeing these savings. So we're seeing a huge cost shift into the PBM pockets. And this is where we really have to have a very shift in direction of prescription drug policy, because usually when we enact policies trying to help the out-of-pocket costs of the patient, we end up putting increased regulatory burden onto the backs of pharmacists. And pharmacists have the least impact on the cost and the price of medication for the patient in the entire regulatory system.
So just so I make sure I understand it, the PBMs take money in form of rebates, and if they don't get enough of a rebate, they actually cost shift a higher copay onto the patient or just switch to a different drug entirely, causing therapeutic chaos. Would that be an accurate assessment?
That's an accurate assessment. I mean, these therapeutic disruptions are an egregious activity. I mean, if a physician and a pharmacist would do that, that would be considered malpractice to the patient, but it's considered to be normal practice by the PBMs.
Oh. Okay. This has been very enlightening. We have recorded this session. So if you have colleagues that want to take a look at it, I will, after this event, circulate a link to the recording. And if you have more questions, Garth, where can people find the Illinois Pharmacists Association online?
We're at ipha.org or on many of our social media outlets. We're at IL Pharmacists.
And Christina, where can we find Canadian Society of Hospital Pharmacists?
Yeah, so we have a website as well, www.cshp.ca, not to be confused with the California Society of Health System Pharmacists, also CSHP. And we also are on social media and all the usual places, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and our @ is CSHP_SCPH.
And thank you for not answering my question with in a hospital. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. We very much appreciate it, and we look forward to speaking to you again in person, maybe next year. Have a nice day.